But it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you. If I don't say the words, then maybe it's not true. And it feels alright when they come and say to you.
Good morning, welcome to NUFC Matters with me, Steve Wraith. It is Ben Jacobs wearing the jumper that everybody wants to see. The famous Nana knitted jumper by Ben. Don't let us down, says Ian Toon Trader. He hasn't. He's got it on. I'm not sure he's Nana knitted it, but welcome, Ben.
It's back by popular demand. Somebody's Nana knitted it, but I paid for it via Zara. But I do like the notion that all of my clothes are just knitted by my Nana. So we can stick with that version if you like as well.
Good to see you, mate, as always. And it's been a couple of weeks since we had you on, and I just wanted to touch, we were talking in the green room just a little bit about Wembley. You know, you asked me, did I enjoy myself? Did I have a good time despite the result? And I said I did. But what was your take on you know, the way Newcastle fans conducted themselves in London and, you know, the final overall from your perspective?
Well, I think that Newcastle can be really excited because it's the start of something big, and they didn't walk away with a trophy, but it won't be the last trip to Wembley or cup final in this new era over the coming seasons. And that's because Newcastle are building something very special on the football field. And from the Newcastle fan perspective, we said in the build-up when I came on before the final, it was important to enjoy the moment. And I think that Newcastle supporters did exactly that. They were down in force. They took over Trafalgar Square. And when you look at the contrast between the two sets of fans, it was really very clear that Newcastle are excited about their future, ambitious, unified. And of course, that's because their takeover happened and a large proportion of the fan base are very excited about it. And a cloud as a result has been lifted. And when you saw that black and white end, it was something very special, as we, I think, expected, because it's been like that at St James's Park pretty much since day one after Mike Ashley left. And then you looked at the Manchester United side, and even as winners of the League Cup, there were chants against the Glazers, and Avram Glazer was there. But when we've seen matches played without him, it's the same kind of chanting, and win or lose, there's always banners against the ownership group at Manchester United. Part of that is, of course, because there's an ongoing sale process. But that's the paradox for me, that the win at the time, even though Manchester United went on to lose 7-0 to Liverpool, felt like a statement to Manchester United because they were at the beginning of this corner turned under Erik ten Hag, which I think was a fair assessment, regardless of the match itself, because they'd beaten Barcelona and there's been an upturn in form. And players like Casemiro, when he stays on the field at least, have been excellent for Manchester United. And Marcus Rashford, we know, is in red hot form as well. So from their perspective, it really felt like quite important to see them lift a trophy that early into Erik ten Hag's tenure. And yet you've got this doom and gloom still around the Glazers, and therein lies the paradox. And then at Newcastle, it's kind of the opposite. They didn't win the trophy, but it is still the start of a new era. And although a statement wasn't won and a major trophy lifted for the first time since 1969, the trip to Wembley still felt really significant because Newcastle are swinging it with the big boys again. They're competing. And I think that Manchester United showed good game management. They took their chances. Newcastle didn't. For large periods of the game, there wasn't too much between the two sides. Newcastle certainly had their spells, but David De Gea kept an important clean sheet. And at the other end, Manchester United just had that nous, that game management, that ability to take their chances. But there still wasn't a massive amount between the two sides. Newcastle, as we've seen really in the second half of the season, couldn't quite find that clinical nature in front of goal. And we've definitely seen them in all matches, win, lose or draw, labour a little bit more in terms of finding goals compared to that run they had leading up to the World Cup. I was going to phrase that as second half of the season, but actually, if you look at the beginning of the season as well, in the first 6 or 7 games, Newcastle was struggling for goals as well. But then they suddenly found that bit of momentum. Miguel Almiron started scoring for fun. And that's why I think that Almiron's winner with the help of a little deflection against Wolves is very significant, as is the goal from Isak, because if those kind of players can get going and Newcastle can score a little bit more freely, then they're going to be able to finish still in the top four. But overall, I thought that it was a magnificent occasion. I think the Newcastle fans were an absolute credit to the football club. It was a phenomenal atmosphere. None of them left early. They appreciated that even though they weren't able to lift a trophy, it was an occasion for the football club and one to relish and enjoy. And I hope those that travelled down had a fantastic 24 or 48 hours. And I think the last thing I'd say on it, which is quite interesting in the context of the season, is because of that loss, which was only February the 26th, it feels somehow like ages away now, and then the defeat to Manchester City. Not only is that 2-1 victory at Wolves significant, but now looking ahead, there's another kind of cup final that is arguably more significant. Easy to say now the League Cup final is over, but in the context of Newcastle's long-term future, home to Manchester United on April the 2nd. And that one feels like a revenge match, but it feels absolutely pivotal. And because Newcastle had gone so long without winning a trophy, fans probably would have said before the League Cup final, they desperately wanted silverware. But now in hindsight, we can change the narrative a little bit and say that game against April the 2nd feels absolutely massive. And if Newcastle can get a statement league win against Manchester United, then they set themselves up for that top four finish heading down the final stretch. And of course, looking further down the line, people will also cite the game against Spurs on April the 23rd. But it just feels like, because of the loss to Manchester City and then a much needed win against Wolves, if Newcastle can back that win up away at Forest, where they're favourites for that game, even though Forest have been relatively solid at home, then you set up that cup atmosphere, that revenge game, that April the 2nd match against Manchester United. And if they can get 3 points in that, because it's West Ham, Brentford, Villa leading up to Spurs, and then Everton and Southampton are very winnable as well, even away at Leeds, Newcastle have got a real opportunity to kind of wrestle back momentum. But if they drop points at Forest and then lose to Manchester United, I think they go from very serious top four contenders, and we were calling them favourites almost just before the World Cup break and just after it, to maybe having more question marks as to whether they can finish in the top four, because obviously they're now, even with games in hand, having to come from behind. And when you are not used to being in this race in recent times, and perhaps you lose to a big rival and you're coming from behind, that's when the doubt starts to creep in a little bit. So I feel like that game on April the 2nd is going to be a cup final repeat in many ways, and one of the biggest games of Newcastle's season.
Yeah, I would agree. Do you think that the pressure got to the team? Because there was a lot of things, really hanging over the team at that time, and not a great deal of experience. Trippier comes, top of the list. He's been in that position before, won a league title, but we had the unbeaten run, which had stretched to 17 games. We had, the best defense in the league, and then you're going to your new cup final. Lots of pressure on a team, and I guess part of the learning curve for Newcastle United's team and squad at this moment in time is learning to cope with that type of pressure, because it's a different type of pressure from being at the bottom of the league trying to stay in it.
Absolutely. You're fighting for your lives, but in some respects, people are writing you off and you're underdogs in certain games. And then there's a weight of expectation, and Manchester United have got know-how type players, whether it's Casemiro or David De Gea. And I think that Erik ten Hag made that point after the final. The experience counts in these kind of games. And you did feel like Newcastle had to score first to really settle the nerves, for want of a better phrase. And that might have been a factor. But if you look at the 0-0 away at Old Trafford in the league, Eddie Howe set up quite a conservative team. And although they play in a 4-3-3, there can be a big difference between Newcastle and a 4-3-3 away at Leicester, or in many home games where they score early, they play with a lot of width, they're direct, and they get a lot of counter-attacks, versus a match against Manchester United where that 4-2-3-1 that United played, Manchester United, of course, stifled the centre of the park, and Fred and Casemiro, I think, were really important to that. Casemiro obviously scored as well, and Bruno Guimaraes never really got into the game, and nor did Callum Wilson in terms of hold-up play. And when you look also at the attempts on goal, I think it was only 2 shots on target for Newcastle as well. So all of that can be analysed as Newcastle showing Manchester United a little bit too much respect or being nervy. But I do think you have to give Manchester United credit, and it's one of the most underrated things we see in football when 2 centre-backs like Varane and Martinez, or 2 central midfielders like Casemiro and Fred, just shut everything down. And you don't always see it at the time, their awareness and positional sense, their intelligence, but everything through the centre was just shut out. And both Almiron and ASM were unable to break through significantly from wide areas as well. And of course, Manchester United ensured that the game had a bit of bite as well. Yellow cards were being chucked around like confetti. There was no rhythm as soon as Manchester United got ahead in the game, particularly when they were 2-0 up and they were early ahead in the game as well by that scoreline. They made sure that the second half was a non-contest. And Newcastle never really found a way back. If they'd have got to 2-1, a different story. But for me, it was the fact that the first goal went in. And if you look at that half an hour before the opening goal, Newcastle were very much in the game. And if they'd have scored the opening goal, different story. But then straight after that first goal, about 5 minutes later, Rashford scores a second, and Eddie Howe's team talk is completely different. And then Newcastle have got to come back against an informed team that have just beaten Barcelona from 2-0 down. And it's very difficult at that point, because then you see the central midfielders and the central defenders just shut everything down. And Shaw and Dalot also dealt with any threats from wide areas very well. And you've got an experienced goalkeeper like David De Gea as well. I don't think the Carrier situation fed into too much. I know that there were some question marks over the first goal, I think it was, but generally speaking, Nick Pope not being there, I don't think made a massive amount of difference. Where Newcastle lost the final was actually in terms of not being able to score first and use their attacking weapons. And this has been a problem beyond just the League Cup final as well. I think since the World Cup break, Newcastle just haven't quite found that rhythm in the final third. And it only underlines how important the defences and players like Sven Botman have been all season. And it reminds me actually of when Leicester won the Premier League in 2015, 2016. I always get in a Leicester reference and a Premier League reference if I possibly can. And I think this one is apt, because there were a number of games where Leicester also just didn't concede too many goals. So they only needed one. And if I think back to Newcastle's season so far in terms of only needing one and keeping clean sheets, there's a lot of examples really where they haven't had to outscore an opponent. They haven't had to be too free flowing. There was that one game in August in the 3-3 against Manchester City, but most of these games have been quite tight from Newcastle's perspective, and they've been able to lean on that defence and clean sheets. I think back to before the World Cup and the 1-0 victory over Chelsea, I think to October and a 1-0 victory off the top of my head. I think it was against Everton, I think in the EFL Cup en route to reaching the final, a 1-0 victory over Bournemouth, a 0-0 draw, which was very credible in January away at Arsenal, a 1-0 victory in January against Fulham springs to mind as well. So we've known all season that Newcastle and clean sheets have gone hand in hand. But what we haven't seen too often, because they've been so good defensively, is what happens when they fall significantly behind. And can they fight back? And can they score 2 or 3? Newcastle's really good games this season have been where they've scored first, they've kept a clean sheet, and then they've dispatched sides with real ruthlessness. The away at Leicester game, the Aston Villa game as well. But what happens when they go 1 or 2-0 down? At what point can they equalise and fight back and win a game 2-1 or 3-1? And they've just not been in that position too many times. And you can't really say, well, they had that chance against Liverpool because there was the sending off of Nick Pope and they lost the game by 2-0. And Manchester City obviously were able to score early through Phil Foden, and then midway through the second half, they killed the game off. And Manchester United, half-time, Newcastle had a mountain to climb. So I'd like to see, even if they end up losing games, more examples of Newcastle coming back into games and coming from 2-0 down to get to 2-2, to sort of show that they've got those weapons to be able to give a side a head start and then be back in the game. Because even against Manchester City, that didn't happen. Newcastle were leading. They were the front runners. They were unlucky not to take all 3 points. They were 3-1 up in the game. So that wasn't an example where they were 3-1 down and equalised to 3-3. And I don't make that point because I'm saying Newcastle don't have the character or the ability. Quite the opposite. They've just not been in that position too often because they've been that good across the whole of this season. But when you need 2 goals in a game, 3 goals in a game, potentially, when you have adversity, can you find that bounce back ability, or do you just not have the weapons? And that's where more is needed from a Callum Wilson. Isak has to find that ability to start more often, score more often. ASM, if he's going to be in the starting lineup, again, needs to contribute with goals. And Miguel Almiron needs to try and recapture that form that we saw in the first half of the season, because then Newcastle do have that ability. And that's, for me, the question mark and the difference. If you look at Newcastle, they've got ahead largely, and they've been in the top 4 for much of the season, and they've still got games in hand, so their fate is in their control. If you look at Spurs, the narrative around them has been much more inconsistent, much more doom and gloom, much more frustration. But still, how many times have they been behind in games and got something from games? So they have shown that even if things aren't going to plan results-wise, and even if people feel like Newcastle are a better team and a more consistent team so far this season, Tottenham have given so many teams head starts this season, and they've come from 2-0 down to get something from a lot of those games. That 3-2 win, for example, against Bournemouth. Whereas Newcastle, 2-0 down against Manchester City, 2-0 down in the League Cup final against Manchester United. There's zeros in both of those games. And I think that's the thing that Eddie Howe will want to stress. Even if you don't come back and take 3 points or even a point, let's find a way of giving ourselves a chance from 1-0 down, 2-0 down, to make sure that we're not leaving those type of games with 0 points and 0 goals. And obviously that's what we saw in the League Cup final. That's what we saw against Liverpool. And that's what we saw against Manchester City as well.
Yeah, definitely. It's Liverpool have got Man City, Chelsea, Arsenal, the next 3 big games. If they lose all 3 and we start winning games, it will be a huge boost for us getting into the Champions League. You're right, Tom. Lots of twists and turns, I'm sure, are going to happen over the course of the next few weeks. Lots of questions coming in, as always, in the chat about links to Newcastle. So Stephen Kennedy just says, does Ben know where the next Haaland is playing? Who is he? How much he's going to cost? And do we have a chance of getting him? I think that's I think you need a crystal ball for that one. But there is Ben McAllister being linked again. Roger Cook asking about that. And another one from Tom, Dusan Vlahovic as well, another player linked. So what about McAllister and Vlahovic?
Well, first of all, the next Haaland is seen as Rasmus Højlund, and he's a phenomenal talent and one that a number of Premier League clubs are monitoring at this stage. So I think Arsenal and Real Madrid are actually the 2 teams that have been scouting him at this point. He's only 20 years of age, plays for Atalanta and the Denmark national team as well. So if you want a glib comparison between Haaland and another profile like him, then definitely worth keeping an eye on Rasmus Højlund. He's 6'1" and is playing regularly in Serie A and starting to score as well, but doesn't quite have the same numbers. But he's come through a relatively similar development, albeit at different clubs, because the training he received when he was at Sturm Graz playing in the Austrian Bundesliga has drawn some very broad comparisons with Haaland's upbringing. He's equally as physical. He loves staying in the box, but the goal scoring numbers are not the same as Erling Haaland at this point. I think it's only 6 goals in Serie A in about 20 or so games, but that's one to watch. And you often see him very loosely compared to Erling Haaland. And then with Dusan Vlahovic, I think there is a very realistic possibility of a move to the Premier League. And Chelsea and Manchester United are the two primary clubs that have been looking at him. Newcastle have sent scouts as well in the past. And Vlahovic isn't particularly happy at Juventus at this point. And because of their 15-point deduction, there's really no guarantee that he is going to have Champions League football next season. Max Allegri's future is unclear. And if Juventus continue to get sanctioned and the Super League is unlikely to happen, they may well need to offload players, and Vlahovic could well be one of them. I think the thing that Newcastle would have to understand if they're to enter that race, and they haven't significantly at this point, is just whether or not he's got any chronic injury problems, because Vlahovic at the World Cup picked up another groin injury, and he seems to have a chronic issue in that area. 4 or 5 times now he's been out with a groin injury, and Juventus therefore have had to run quite extensive tests to try and understand the problem a little bit better. And the last thing that Newcastle want is to sign a player of his quality and then find that there's that injury issue hovering in the background, because Newcastle ultimately need fit players, and they know firsthand from Callum Wilson how frustrating it is to have a phenomenal talent who isn't always fit. But with a player like Vlahovic, it's important, I think, for Newcastle to start legwork now, but understand that if they don't make Champions League football, they'll have to effectively downgrade to a different target, because those kind of players are unlikely to make a move to the Premier League without guaranteed Champions League football next season. And then the other one that Newcastle are looking at, who's a very different kind of forward, and I've mentioned this many times, is so-called Kvaradona, who is over at Napoli and is a Georgian forward or playmaker or winger. He's versatile. He can play in a variety of different positions. Kvaratskhelia is his actual name, but he's known as Kvaradona after Maradona. And there's a sort of beautiful poetry there, because the last time Napoli won Serie A, it was Maradona, and now Kvaradona, along with Victor Osimhen, is leading them to success. And he's a goals and assists machine at the moment, and the partnership with Osimhen is incredible. So Newcastle and Manchester City are very interested in him, but they have to understand what's possible, because Napoli are flying. They're on a procession to Serie A. And on top of that, they are Champions League contenders. So regardless of what happens this season, everything is going according to plan at Napoli, and they're going to want to hang on to their best players. So it's not going to be possible for Kvaradona and Osimhen to leave in the summer. It's either one or the other, or neither. And Napoli will do their utmost to offer Kvaradona a new deal, because he only joined them at the beginning of the season. He's played less than 30 games for the football club. But that power of Premier League spending and the lucrative wages that can be offered are always going to tempt players. So it can't be ruled out, but I sense it's Osimhen or Kvaradona. And I feel like Osimhen is more likely, because he's been at Napoli longer and he's already said in public that the Premier League is his dream. So Newcastle are not really looking at Osimhen. It's more Manchester United and Chelsea at this point. And I think the other thing from Newcastle's perspective is just that Eddie Howe is in favour of that more versatile player at this stage. So if we fast forward 2-3 years down the line, then he has to wait and see how Isak settles. And Callum Wilson doesn't have tons of seasons ahead of him. So it may be that Newcastle do come in for a more traditional kind of number 9, and Vlahovic would fall into that category. And they've also looked at Tammy Abraham as well, without really advancing anything, but he's been on their radar as well. And I think that Abraham might be quite open to coming back and playing within the Premier League sooner rather than later. But generally, the number one priorities for Howe are more your Maddison type players that can play a little bit deeper and can sort of shift across the lines and go wide and also central. And in doing so, really link up all of the play and allow Newcastle to be a little bit more versatile. And I think that's just part of a fast, speedy, counter-attacking team that Eddie Howe wants. Whereas if he brings in a rigid target man and sticks with a 4-3-3, it remains to be seen whether Newcastle will be a little bit stagnant, and that target man, the way that Newcastle play, is going to have to drop a bit deeper and come outside of the box in order to link up play, especially in games when Newcastle surrender possession and become reliant on strong, fast, direct ball playing players that can move the ball forwards quickly. So when people talk about the next Haaland, I don't think that's right for Newcastle, because Haaland spends most of his time in the box. And to do that, you need a lot of the ball, and you need to be very direct, and you need to have a lot of players doing the legwork to create the space to finally provide the service. Whereas I think with Newcastle, they like to get it wider, they like to move the ball quickly, they like to change the direction, and they have less of the ball. So then when they win the ball back, they need to ensure that that target man, their most central forward, is not too isolated, is not too far forwards, because they may be needed in order to link up the play. So they have to be faster, they have to be more versatile, even if eventually they are the ones that end up in the box as a more traditional number 9, which is why at the moment, tactically, not every traditional number 9 is a complete fit for the way that Newcastle play football. And I think that's why Eddie Howe is looking more at the Maddison type player, but there's still that long-term awareness that Callum Wilson will need replacing. And I don't think that Isak is a replacement for Wilson numerically. I think that Isak is there to alleviate the burden on Wilson and maybe eventually come in and play more games. But as soon as Wilson leaves the football club, then there'll have to be a one out, one in. And I think Eddie Howe said that with Chris Wood as well when he left for Nottingham Forest. It might not be like for like in terms of exact profile, but if Wilson ever leaves the club, I don't think it's seen within the recruitment team as, but that's fine, we've already got Isak. It's more, he's there to fight for competition and hopefully succeed and eventually be an automatic starter, but they still need another. And therefore, if they qualify for the Champions League, I can see them strengthening in that area. And that's the thing with Newcastle. There's still work to be done, because when you move this fast, this quick, and you end up pushing for Champions League, or even just getting any form of European football come the end of the season, which is highly likely at this stage for Newcastle United, you need depth. So what Newcastle needed last January, as in January of last season, rather than the window that's just shut, was to firefight and find quality to stay up. But they weren't thinking about depth. They weren't really thinking about long-term planning. They weren't really thinking about youth. And now they need to prioritize quality, depth. And if they are to reach the Champions League, then they need a variety of different players in different positions. I think left back is one area where they need to strengthen. I think they could do with a playmaker who can also go into wide areas. They can potentially still bring in another winger, depending on outgoings. And because ASM's future is still a little bit up in the air, they might need a kind of wide forward / winger as well, that likes to stay out wide but can score goals. So there's all kinds of areas where Newcastle can still strengthen. And then a more central midfielder could still come in and add a bit of depth, which is why Newcastle are very keen on Scott McTominay as well. So you could argue that, but the Newcastle can end up being the victim in a recruitment sense of their own success, because the quicker they achieve Champions League football, the more work on the recruitment side there is to do.
Okay, halfway through the show, time for the ads.
A big thanks to all our sponsors, Skips and Bins. You can find them at skipsandbins.com. Telephone 0800 25 45 25 3. Email inquiries at skipsandbins.com. Easy contract, free and pay as you go, waste collection. Thanks to Mr. Vicky's sauces, which are handmade in Cumbria. You can order them from mrvickies.co.uk or by calling 01768 210 102. Welcome aboard to Fruy Vita Getaways. You can email them at fruivitagetaways@gmail.com. Call or text them 0792 842 7895. Please join and share the Facebook group as well at Fruy Vita Getaways. Book your holidays or short breaks in the UK or around the world with them. Let them find your happy place. ABTA and ATOL registered. Thanks to Media Arts for all the help with the video side of things. And thanks to qtechshop.co.uk, the makers of pool tables and snooker tables in Wallsend, Newcastle. And the guys who run our website, NUFCmatters.com, where you can buy lots of t-shirts and merchandise. If you want to subscribe to the show, hit the subscribe button underneath this video today. It is free to do so. Hit the thumb up to like the video. It's good for the algorithm. And click share to your other social media. If you do subscribe, we do send you a free car sticker. To get that, email john@nufcmatters.com and he'll post you one out. If you want to join the NUFC Matters cult, then put your smartphone over this QR code now and it will take you straight there. Alternatively, go to the website, nufcmatters.com, and you can join for a one-off payment of £25. You'll receive a cup, a pen, a membership card, and a scarf, and entry into the monthly draw. You can also join via YouTube, and if you click join beneath the video, you will see a variety of prices and how you can support the channel. You can alternatively make a donation with a super chat in the chat tonight. Just click the $sign. We're also available on iTunes and Spotify and other podcast providers. We also help the food bank on this show. NUFCfansfoodbank.co.uk is where you'll find the matchday bucket, and you can make a virtual donation 365 days of the year. As always, we've got a whole host of events coming up throughout the year. An evening with Nobby Solano takes place on Saturday the 25th of March at the Tyneside Irish Centre. Tickets £15. Book now at nufcmatters.com. An evening with Peter Beardsley at Leamington Labour Club. Tickets are £20. 31st of March. And you can get them direct from the venue. An evening with Nobby Solano. Good Friday the 7th of April at 4 p.m. Tickets are a tenner and available behind the bar at Felling Cricket Club in Gateshead. An evening with Supermac, hosted by Gibbo at the Tynemouth Surf Cafe, Tuesday the 11th of April. And tickets direct from the venue. This is a limited ticket event, only 35 tickets available, so book soon. And an evening with Frank Clark and John Gibson, Thursday the 20th of April. Tickets are £15. Book now at nufcmatters.com. In June, Rob Lee will be at Louis' Liquor Store in Newcastle, and you can get tickets direct from the venue. And an evening with Rob Lee, Lee Clark, John Beresford takes place the following evening, Friday the 2nd of June at the Grand Hotel in Gosforth. This is in aid of the Heel and Toe charity, and tickets are available from their website, www.heelandtoe.org.uk/events. And if you're a boxing fan, the Night of Champions comes to Gateshead at the Fed. Frank Bruno, Ricky Hatton, Nigel Benn, and Joe Calzaghe are part of the UK tour, and you can get your tickets from www.goldstarpromotions.co.uk.
Darren Lee says, I see we're linked again with Kieran Tierney this morning, but Arsenal want 40 million for him. Surely we should look elsewhere. He's not worth 40 million. What's your take on that one, Ben?
Yeah, this was a story that I broke a few weeks back about Tierney being very possibly on the way out of Arsenal. And it will all depend on the player, really, and his appetite to fight for his place, because Alexander Zinchenko's come in at Arsenal and done fantastic. Tierney's only played 4 Premier League games, but he was an ever-present last season. And I'm sure if you ask Mikel Arteta, he'd love to keep Tierney at the club and have that depth, but it's about the player and his desire to get regular minutes. And Newcastle are looking, because as I said before, the left-back position is an area that they would love to strengthen. And 40 million might seem like a lot of money, but if you look last season when Tierney was in strong form and playing regularly, there were even links with Real Madrid, and Carlo Ancelotti is indeed a big fan of the player. And at that point, the price tag was 50 million. So a lot of things go into the actual price. One is how long's left on the contract, and Arsenal have got a lot of flexibility here because Tierney's contracted until 2026. So that will be a factor in why a lot of people believe the fee is a little bit higher. And the second thing to say is that Arsenal paid 25 million for Tierney, so they will want more. And when clubs try and make a profit, they're not only looking at what they paid, they're also factoring in wages and any other expenses, bonuses, and so on, and just general estimations on costs such as training or logistics, coaching. So when you're trying to work out what is an actual profit, it's not just we paid X, we want Y, it's we've paid X and the player's cost us X since he's been at the club and he's healthily contracted. So if we're to entertain offers, this is the number that we would be looking for. And Arsenal are not necessarily at this point quoting Tierney as available or on the market, but I think that Newcastle sense, as do Monaco, by the way, that there might be an opportunity because the player is unhappy only playing in the Europa League at the moment, and not a lot's going to change because Alexander Zinchenko has been excellent so far. I think the only thing that could alter potentially is a bit like the Mark Cucurella, Ben Chilwell dynamic at Chelsea, where people thought it was one or the other, and now Graham Potter is experimenting with both. Zinchenko does have that ability to play in more than one position. So if he vacates left back, Tierney can come in and Zinchenko could theoretically move into midfield, but it's looking unlikely at the moment. And Arteta's not really going to tweak too much between now and the end of the season because Arsenal have got a winning formula, which means by the end of the season, Tierney may decide that he's not surplus to requirements. That's the wrong way of phrasing it, but unhappy with his squad role within the team. And that's where Newcastle may have a window of opportunity because I think that they would like still a starting left back. And that's no disrespect to Dan Burn, but if Newcastle are in Europe, then they will want, I think, a Champions League style left back if they can possibly find one. And Tierney might not go down well with the Newcastle fan base, but we have to look back at other signings. Like when Newcastle brought in Matt Targett, people were dubious. And I actually thought he did really well at that time and hit the ground running and became a little bit of a fan favourite. So don't read too much into the price tag, because the market's inflated at the moment and Tierney's very well contracted. We know that Newcastle won't pay above the odds, but the key in all of this is, do they believe because of the player's age and form for Arsenal last season, that's value for money? And if they do, and maybe they can get it down to 35 million and there's player buy-in, that one could be a realistic possibility. Tierney's future is certainly one to watch this summer.
Any truth in Iliman and Dye moving from Sheffield United this summer, asks BT.
Don't really know a lot about this one, to be honest with you. Haven't made too many inquiries on it. But as far as the actual player is concerned, very highly rated, that's for sure. He's only 23 years of age and is an attacking midfielder who has also won a few caps for Senegal as well. And this season, he's very much picked up on last campaign where we saw a breakthrough and flashes of his goal-scoring ability. And I think he scored 6 or 7 goals in the championship last campaign and is already now in double figures as well. So naturally, clubs are looking, and Newcastle are one of those that have scouted the player for sure. But that's about all I know, to be perfectly honest with you. Everton were the club as well that have looked at him in the past. So those are 2 clubs to watch. West Ham have also sent some scouts to him too. And this is normal, really, when you see a breakthrough player in the championship, still relatively young, and backing up last season with this season as well. And I think he scored against Spurs in the FA Cup as well at Bramall Lane. So there would have been a fair few at that game watching him as well. So Everton were the club that had actually inquired in January, and the player didn't want to move. And the reason for that is pretty obvious. I think joining Everton in mid-season from a championship club doesn't guarantee you Premier League football at this point next season. So the timing is really off. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over the course of the coming weeks. Newcastle are certainly one of the clubs that have gone and sent scouts, which is very normal at this stage of the season, but I'm unaware of anything more advanced than that at this stage.
Okay, always plenty of questions coming in with regards to players. Let's change it round a little bit and see whether there's anything slightly different in the questions. Morning, guys, says David John Cook. Ben, do you think there has been a difference in the media's reporting around the possible Qatari takeover at Manchester United compared to how our takeover was viewed?
I think there's similarities and differences. The similarities are the same fans that perhaps predominantly via social media were criticising Newcastle's takeover and against that type of ownership all now have Qatari flags in their handles, and that is just football. And some would call that sports washing because people are very easily won over by money and ambition, and others would term it hypocrisy because nobody that wasn't a Newcastle fan from other clubs that was very vocal against the PIF wanted the deal done. And many of them were worried about Newcastle becoming a new player and it being a big seven in the Premier League. And now, obviously, if they're Manchester United fans, many of them have got Qatar flags in their handles and are very much in favour of the bid from Sheikh Jassim. But we're also seeing, as we did with the Newcastle United takeover, that social media isn't always reflective of the fan base. And in the same way, there were plenty of Newcastle fans that wanted to know exactly what PIF's plans were and more transparency over their ownership. When Manchester United do polls via media or fan aggregators, not as many as you think away from social media are voting for the Sheikh Jassim bid. It's a pretty equal split. Perhaps it's even slightly in favour of the Sir Jim Ratcliffe bid, which I think is quite interesting as well, because we get sucked into the mood being read from social media, and that's where it can get toxic. But we have to remember that football fans use all kinds of mediums and are from all kinds of different demographics. So we can't only read a reflection of the fan base via social media and assume that that is representative of an entire fan base. And then as far as the media coverage is concerned, it's very different in many ways, because the Newcastle takeover started having media coverage at large in the domain of scrutiny, sports washing, criticism, ownership, once there were problems. So of course we covered it as media when it was developing and everyone knew that Mike Ashley wanted to sell. But I think the big bugbear from the Newcastle fan base against media, including myself, it has to be said, was the coverage actually after there were problems and the Premier League were unwilling to quickly pass the owners and directors test. And obviously the Manchester United takeover is not at that point at this stage. So the media coverage will be different, because with Newcastle, we knew who the group was. Everybody could see from their website who was on the PIF board that their chairman was Mohammed bin Salman. And we were all aware of the piracy issue, which was a significant backdrop to the takeover as well of Newcastle. And there was the geopolitics between Qatar and Saudi Arabia too. So that was laid bare for everyone from every angle to discuss and debate. And then there were the ongoing court cases as well. Whereas with the Manchester United takeover, it's easy to say, well, why were you on your high horse about Qatar, about Saudi and PIF and not about Qatar? But they're at different stages. So all we know about the Qatar bid is that it's from Sheikh Jassim, who's a private investor, and he's trying to buy Manchester United on behalf of the 9-2 Foundation. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know, and I've lived in Qatar, that the strategy is still being driven by the Emir. And to get the bid to this point, a series of senior stakeholders connected to government and connected to QSI have had a say, whether that's an informal one or a formal one, because you can't try and buy Manchester United without the Emir knowing about it, without QSI knowing about it, without Qatar's Sovereign Wealth Fund knowing about it. So that's what I mean about them being at different stages, because I would be being quite irresponsible as a journalist to take this stage and assume they'll fail an owners and directors test, or assume that UEFA will have a problem, because it's not been revealed who the group is. So within the bid itself, to get to this point, it's absolutely true that significant stakeholders from government have been involved, but there's no problem with that, because anyone buying anyone can seek the advice of consultants or individuals. They're experts in the field. That's not a conflict of interest. The conflict is if they'll have any influence over the group should they be successful, and the conflict of interest is if there is a problem between them and PSG, and the conflict of interest is if anybody that might fail the owners and directors test or have undue influence over the football club is actually directly involved in the group. And until they reveal who their group is, we have a responsibility as journalists to push for scrutiny, and we have a responsibility to try and find clarity on that. But it's one person at the moment that's been named, and it's a brand new vehicle to buy it. So we're going to have to wait a little bit of time, I think, before the wave of media coverage questioning and scrutinizing it develops. And that's not because people did one thing for Newcastle and another thing for Manchester United. It's because Newcastle was more developed and advanced at the point where the media got involved, and Manchester United isn't. If you give me every member of the group and tell me who they're connected to and start a website saying who their board members are, then at that point, I will give exactly the same coverage as I did to Newcastle, to Manchester United, positive or negative on merit, depending on what I see. And then a little bit broader than that, I think every fan base feels like somebody's got an agenda against their club if they don't like the coverage. But Newcastle fans are probably not as across the Manchester United takeover in the same day-to-day way as they were the Newcastle one. They're not as invested in it. So it can feel like, oh, that Ben Jacobs popped up on my feed every day with Newcastle. Where is he with Manchester United? But that's just your algorithm and it's your personal taste. You're not looking for Manchester United content. You're looking for Newcastle content. But I have to tell you that I've put as much time, as much investment, as many articles, as many broadcasts, as many spaces, as many fan shows into Manchester United as I did for Newcastle United. I hope I've been as balanced, and many of my colleagues are doing exactly the same thing, because I get tagged in people saying, hey, Miguel Delaney or Henry Winter or Tom Morgan, why are you saying this when we all want Qatar, we all love Qatar, we'll blindly follow Qatar? And they're all from the same people. They're all from people with Qatar flags in their handles. So we're getting the same feedback. We're getting the same engagement from Manchester United fans. So for me, it actually feels very similar in terms of that media to fan engagement as it did with Newcastle United. But again, important to point out, with Newcastle United, we had all the names. We had the board members in front of us. We had the organisation in front of us. We had the structure in front of us. We knew about the politics. We knew about the piracy. So not everything was transparent, but we certainly knew where to go to put together context as to what was happening and then report accordingly. Whereas with Manchester United, it's too early in the process. So we don't really know who's part of the group at this point. We're asking, but maybe they've even not established it because they've not even done any due diligence yet. And I think that's why some fans may note a difference in media coverage, because Newcastle was advanced and Manchester United is still advancing.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting stuff. Good answer as well, Ben. Do you think that Maddison will sign a new deal at Leicester, or do you think he'll leave with Rodgers now under pressure, says Tom?
Difficult for Leicester to hold on to James Maddison, and Leicester, obviously, if they go down, and I don't want to talk about that, will be losing James Maddison. No way that he would stay in the Championship for Leicester. But it's that point in his career where, off the back of a World Cup where he was called up, and okay, he wasn't fit for large parts of it, but when he recovered and trained, he didn't get any minutes. And he will be acutely aware that his best chance of being an integral player for the 2026 World Cup, even though that might seem quite a long way away, is to get 2 or 3 seasons of European football and force his way into the England conversation. And Leicester's not the place to do that at the moment. So he had a fantastic season last campaign, a brilliant start to this campaign before he got injured as well. And I think there's a real feeling, even though Leicester would love to offer Maddison a new deal, that the time is right for him to leave. And that's why there's a range of suitors like Newcastle and Tottenham starting to circle. So my personal view is that Leicester may try and get Maddison to sign a new deal, but given where they are in the league table and the fact they're not going to get European football next season, it's going to be very difficult for Leicester to hang on to James Maddison.
Okay, and we'll watch that one with interest, as always. Roger says, is there a front runner, Saudi Airlines or Riyadh Air? Sponsorship
of Newcastle.
Yeah.
But I think it's very likely that Newcastle will bring in a sponsor from the MENA region. As far as I'm aware, they've been talking to multiple partners, and we have to wait and see as well whether PIF prioritize a commercial deal or more messaging. And if it's messaging, it lends itself towards tourism or an airline, because that's the thing that promotes wider Saudi Arabia, which is one of the tenets of Vision 2030, where they're trying to ensure that they get more Westerners over there, that they also get more transit passengers stopping in Saudi Arabia as opposed to Qatar and then passing on to other places. And that's a huge area of business. And then there's new or relatively new projects like NEOM, which is going to have a big sports part. It's kind of a Western super city. It's hosted beach soccer and will be the host of the Asian Winter Games as well. And the Red Sea project as well. And all of these things are very conducive with either an airline or Visit Saudi, because they're the ones either promoting them or flying there. And that's a big part of what Saudi Arabia want to push. So there's a lot of interest from that area. Whereas when people start to link Newcastle with Aramco or anything in oil and gas, I think those type of sponsors are less likely. It's not guaranteed that every commercial deal that Newcastle United do will be specifically in Saudi Arabia, but I think it's logical that that's where PIF want to try and grow and promote, because first of all, there's a lot of money there, but second of all, it fits into that wider vision. And I think this summer with sponsorship, we're going to see the first real flex by the PIF part of this ownership group, and find out a little bit more about, beyond just the football side, on the brand side, what Newcastle is going to be used as a vehicle for. And, you know, critics have always said that that will be sports washing, but you have to be very fair and wait and see what the deals are, and if they're at fair market value and why they've been done. And nobody anymore says that Etihad Airlines is sports washing. It's an airline that is a business and is trying to draw people to it, because they're up against Emirates Airlines in the UAE. They're up against Qatar Airways, and Emirates have been heavily involved in football. Qatar Airways, of course, were on the front of the shirt of Barcelona as well. So I think people accept that there is a broader thing at play with Newcastle, as far as tourism, as far as Saudi Arabia, as far as the MENA region. But it doesn't always have to be sports washing. Sometimes it can make commercial sense. And the Etihad deal is so large for the shirt sponsorship at Manchester City, partially because it's immersive. And that's what I've always been told about Newcastle and any sponsorship, that they want immersive. They want a 2-for-1 sponsor, a 3-for-1 sponsor. And by that, I mean, if you were Chelsea and they're going to be giving up the 3 sponsorship at the end of the season, as per my understanding, it's great to have a sponsor like that. I know they kind of fell out when Abramovich left the football club, but regardless of that, it's great to have that kind of sponsor. And the same if we go back to like Newcastle Brown Ale, because that latter one, it's invested within the community. It's iconic in many ways, always had a very cool logo, but it's local. And with 3, the type of industry is also local, because who's going to buy 3 in America, for example? So you can tap into the demographic and you can provide offers and partnerships, but you can't be truly global. Whereas if you're an airline or in technology, then you can utilize the sponsorship to be very global and show your product to the world. And as importantly, it's accessible to the world, which means you can make a lot more money from it. And on top of that, you may be able to expand your deal with the club in more immersive ways. So it's not just about what is known as badging. In other words, we're paying for our logo on the front of the shirt. It's about investing in other areas of the club. So if you're an airline, you can offer Newcastle flight deals. You can bring Newcastle to Saudi Arabia. If you are in data or technology, you might be able to sponsor one thing, but invest in another area of the club as well. And that is the modern type of sponsorship deal that Newcastle are looking for, because first of all, they can put higher value on that. And second of all, the sponsor gets more of a return. So I'm still kind of being told that Newcastle have been seeking not just high value, but quality and a long-term partnership that doesn't just give them money, but gives them a bit extra from whoever that partner is, which is why if we judge it on that criteria, Newcastle's major sponsors will have more of a likelihood to be in aviation or technology or tourism, because that's where the value is, but also they're far broader than just partnering with somebody that wants their logo on the front of a shirt.
Yeah, again, it's something which is going to run and run as far as Newcastle United is concerned. Jody Toombalite will squeeze this one. He says, have we any interest in Mohamed Kudus? The lad has real talent.
Yeah, it does, absolutely. And Erik ten Hag is looking to link up with him as well. Newcastle have tracked the player too. There's a few teams, really, even Chelsea have taken a look as well. It's going to be very difficult for Ajax to keep hold of him. He's had a breakthrough season playing in an advanced position and has scored 11 goals in 24 games. And I think the fit with Newcastle is actually that Kudus at the moment is playing in a front three as a wide forward, but his preferred position is attacking midfield. So it's a strange one in many ways, because if you like Kudus now, then you're buying a forward. But if you listen to where Kudus wants to play, he's an attacking midfielder. And I think, as I said before, Newcastle would quite appreciate an attacking midfielder, especially one that has the versatility to play in a more advanced position. Whereas with Manchester United, they might be liking the player at the moment, and Erik ten Hag knows him well, but they want a traditional number 9. So regardless of how well he's scoring at the moment, if the signing is done and then the player says, well, I don't want to play where I was playing at Ajax and scoring all of those goals, then it becomes a little bit counterproductive. So Newcastle are there for sure. There's nothing advanced at this point. There's nothing moving towards the summer. But interestingly, they had scouts watching him at the World Cup where he scored 2 goals, and they were considering him as a possible January move. So there's a little bit of history there with Newcastle and Mohamed Kudus, and now we have to wait and see whether they rekindle that. It's one of those, again, where now, because of his form and because of the level of interest, the player would largely prefer European football. So he was very, very close to joining Everton last summer, and it could well have happened. He spoke directly with Frank Lampard. He was given a very clear game plan. He liked the coach, which tells you that the manager could be very important in any possible move in terms of having a direct conversation with him. But he stayed at Ajax and has done very well this season. And Newcastle, as I say, saw him at the World Cup, are sending scouts to see him. But they're not committed at this point. I wouldn't say that anything is concrete or genuine. It was probably closer in January to them thinking about moving than now, but the price wasn't right. And Ajax made it clear that they were not prepared to sell mid-season. So at the end of the season, he's going to be in a strong position because he can pick and choose his club. And Newcastle might return and be one of them. But keep an eye out on Manchester United as well, because their interest in the player is very genuine.
Okay, as Julie says, kudos to him. Yes, just the other all week. Ben, fantastic to have you back on, mate. As always, great insight. Got through a lot of ground there. Look forward to having you back on very soon. Have a good week, mate.
Yeah, have a good week. Good luck to Newcastle against Nottingham Forest. We'll speak soon.
Take care, pal. Bye-bye.